All right. So I want to start with a question this morning. What are three of the most common topics to be avoided around the dinner table? So I hear politics, religion, gross stuff. Right? There's a whole bunch of things that we could add, but I think largely, for sure, politics, religion, and I would even put money in there to a little bit of a degree, and there's, of course, a whole bunch of other things, whether you want to say sex or gross things. Last time in New Auburn, at homework, can't talk about homework at the dinner table, I guess, because it just strikes fear into the kids. Oh, I don't. But one of the reasons I think that it's so difficult to discuss some of those big things like politics and religion is because they're so deeply embedded and entwined within some of our belief systems, right? And obviously, we're not all the same. Surprise, 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 right? And so we have some differing beliefs and some different views on how these things should operate. Right? And it's no doubt that when you have people with different points of view, that sometimes they can butt heads and you can get into a conflict when you discuss those. And if you're adamant that you're going to win and that you're right, well, guess what? Those conversations escalate to a point where people get uncomfortable. So many families, say, well, guess what? We're not going to talk about that because we don't want to deal with the conflict, right? Even within the church, we kind of operate under this same premise, right? We don't really like to talk about these things because we don't want conflict within the church. The problem is, folks, that I think largely the issue is not so much these issues or these topics, but rather the fact that we've forgotten how to respectfully engage in conversation on them, right? And we do also have to remember that when we discuss these, it's not so much important that we win the conversation or prove the other person right, but that we're actually being open-minded enough to consider what that other person is saying, looking at the beliefs we hold and seeing whether there's an influence and we might need to change our beliefs or our understandings rather than seeking to change that other person. And so one of the dangers in not talking about them is that, guess what? How can we ever engage with some of these issues if we're not willing to talk about them together? And friends, I really believe that us as Christians and that the church, now more than at any time, but pretty much all throughout history of the church, needs to speak into these issues and needs to help people to engage in these discussions, because otherwise we just become silent, and then pretty soon we feel like all of these voices, whether it be from culture or from government or wherever, seep in, and we kind of feel like we're on the defense, right? Like we have to accept what's being told to us, and sometimes that makes us uncomfortable. So friends, we are going to read a story today from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. And as I read it, I'm going to suggest that this might be a rather difficult or challenging story for some of us, especially given our context within America and North America. And so one of the things that I encourage you to do, because as you read, I suspect you're going to have some things bubble up for you, but think about some of the money or resource programs that you have in your life. Okay, and by programs, I mean think about the way that you think about money, about the way that you use money and resources, and I'm going to suggest that some of those things, some of your thinking runs so deep that it's almost at a subconscious level. It's things that you've learned from the very time you were born. It's things that you watched your parents or grandparents do, and somehow you have picked up some of these things, and you may not even be aware of why you act the way you act when it comes to the giving or sharing or use of resources. Okay, and so as an illustration, let me give you an example. So how many of you are familiar with the financier Susie Orman? Right? Many of you at least heard her name, right? Pretty successful business lady. Whether you like her advice or not, I'll leave that up to you. But I remember reading a story about her, and she discovered that an event really spurred for her and really gave her a whole new openness with regard to specifically money, but resources in general. And so she grew up in what I would say is a fairly financially or economically conservative house. Her father specifically was very tight with money and was, pretty scrutinous in the way that he spent money. And she said she remembered one night that the shop that her mom and dad owned started on fire. And her father raced into this burning shop to save the cash register. And he came out and his hands were all burned from grabbing onto this cash register. But she said, in that moment, I never realized how deeply and tightly my father held on to money. Right? That he was willing to put his life at risk to run into a burning building to grab a cash register out of that building. And she said that event really changed and transformed the way, because she realized that she too was starting to develop some of those same thoughts and patterns with her use to money. And she said, wow, I don't really want to put my life at risk to run in after a few dollar bills. Okay? So those are the kind of things that I encourage you to think about. And the reason we're going to encourage you to think about those is because later this fall, we're going to start a series on stewardship. And I hope that this message today sort of creates a primer for that a little bit later. Now, so here's the story from Luke, starting with verse 19. It's called The Rich Man and Lazarus. So there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham from far away, with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He said to them, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. All right. So friends, as we begin our story, or before we begin it, I want to ask you another question, and I want you to name some wealthy, successful, or famous people for me. The Rockefellers. Dale Gumness. Anybody else? Now you started something, David. Now you're in trouble, right? But Donald Trump, right? We could add a whole bunch. Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett. We could go through a whole bunch of them, right? And we could name them all. We could add a whole bunch of celebrities, a whole bunch of athletes, right? Because there's something about those names and the things that they have accomplished or acquired that we ascribe importance to, right? And to some degree, we even begin to want to emulate them because of the success that they have had, right? But as we begin our story, what's the name of the rich man? They didn't say, right? Now, isn't that fascinating? That in this earthly realm that we live in, oftentimes we remember these great people, right? Or we consider them great, so we ascribe their names. We remember who they are and what they've done. But noticeably in this story, the rich man's name is left out, all right? And I think it's interesting because many times, and we'll see this later, God flips the kingdom upside down. And what's important in this earthly realm is not as important in the realm or the kingdom of the heavens, right? And so we get to look at some of that as we go through. Now, our story then, deals with economic inequality from the very start, right? And this has become a really big buzzword in our culture today, right? And we, again, not surprisingly, have a whole bunch of arguments about how true this is or how we should fix this or what we should do. And again, largely it's tied with politics and our belief, whether you're conservative or more liberal, and what you think are the proper ways to figure all of this out. But again, we need to remember that for Jesus, he's, again, talking about something very important in the Scriptures. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about the two famous parables, right? The parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. And I asked you, who's invited to your table, right? Because much of the discussion that Jesus is having here is with the Pharisees. The Pharisees in the Scriptures take the role of the antagonists here. And they're constantly kind of challenging Jesus on what they should do and who should be invited to the table. And Jesus is saying, no. You're inviting only people that you think are prominent. You're inviting only people you think are important. But really, your table needs to be open to everyone. Right? And in fact, I might say that it really should be open to the people you might not normally invite because they're the most in need of sitting at your table. And so as we read this story, we have to keep that in context because Jesus here shifts slightly from who's invited to the table to actually talking about wealth and resources and how we are to utilize those wealth and resources in the relationships that we have. All right? And so again, there's great disparity between the rich man and Lazarus, right? This rich man dresses in the finest clothes that there are. He wears purple and fine linens. He dresses almost as royalty, right? Purple being the color of royalty in the ancient world. And he lives in complete luxury. We can just almost imagine him sitting at this large table every day, just feasting on whatever he wants to eat and drink. And yet every day, at his gate of his residence, he walks by this poor guy, this poor person that somehow drags himself to sit at the gate and beg for food. And he doesn't really beg for too much. He'd be satisfied with just the few scraps that would fall off of this guy's table. All right? And he's covered with sores, and nobody pays him any attention except the dogs that run by and lick the sores on his body. Now that's kind of a disgusting thought, right? Many of us would say this guy is despicable. Most of us would be like, I don't know if I want to even get close to this guy or not. But I think that that's exactly the point that Jesus is making, right? He's saying, look, this guy doesn't want anything great, right? He doesn't want, all of your money. He doesn't want all of your food. He's happy with just having his needs provided. He just wants somebody to see him. He just wants somebody to recognize him, and he would like a little bit to eat, just enough to fill his belly, even if it's the scraps that fall off the table. All right? And so, friends, the picture here is very dire. The contrast is put there intentionally, okay? And yet it's interesting because, again, you go back to this idea of who's welcome to the table. Does the rich man invite Lazarus to his table? No. And so we're left with this question of what might have happened had the rich man taken but an instant to take this guy out a plate of food, or to witness it, to walk up to him and say, look, is there something I can do to help you? Or maybe, what happens if I extend a job or I extend a stay in my house, right? And we begin to ask those kind of questions. Now, friends, as I said, economic inequality is really becoming a hot button issue for us. And like so many things in this country, we are becoming increasingly divided over this, largely because it runs along some of our political beliefs. But one of the things that I want us to consider, and again, if you are color challenged, this map is very difficult to see and read, and I apologize for that, but it's one of the most interesting maps that I could find. And this map is a map of the world income map, okay? And rather than using a median income, it tends to use what's called a PPP parity. It's a purchasing power parity. And what this means is that the purchasing power parity exchange rate, the rate at which currency of one country would have been converted into that of another country to buy the same amount of goods and services in each country. So what it does is it kind of evens out the field so that all currencies are equal and that all goods are equal. And then it assigns the income ratio to the countries based on how much they earn or make, okay? Now, again, if you look at the United States and you do some research, our median income within the United States is about $65,000 to $70,000. Okay? Now this map converts this to the PPP, and so it would place us within about $24,000 to $30,000 based on that range. All right, and you can see the areas that make that much, right? We're in the top, 10% or the top 1% of all places in the world when it comes to how much money we make. You know, you've got the US, you've got Western Europe, and you've got Australia, right? Those are the highest income earners within the world. Then you move to that sort of reddish color, you get most of Eastern Europe, Russia, and a whole bunch of South America. And then you move to the purple areas, and you now have some of the poorest countries in the world. People who might make only $300 a year in this PPP ratio. Okay, so, we have to admit and agree that there's a large amount of disparity between the wealth that we have in our country or that we experience in our lives and what the rest of the world earns and makes. So I want to try to take us down a road, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is a very sensitive topic, and I'm going to try to walk a middle line here as best I can. But one of the things that was interesting, and you guys did it a little bit here, is that oftentimes when we talk about, and I asked you for the names of successful people, right, we rattle off all the big CEOs or all the big top name athletes or celebrities that seem to make a lot of money, right? We kind of have this fascination with people who are successful, right? And we spend a lot of time, for some reason, caring about the things that they do and think. Right? I'm a little bit amazed at how much influence we let some of these people have in our lives. But we also have shifted in this country to have a very negative view of people who are in, let's say, the top 10% of earners. Right? We've really, in some ways, begun to vilify the billionaires of the world because we sit there and look at some of the extravagant lifestyles they have and say, you know what, that's ridiculous. When you're buying a yacht that costs 10 times more than my house and you got to raise bridges to get the yacht underneath the bridge to get it out so you can actually use it, that's a little bit much, right? It's interesting because my kids are getting to that age, and for me it's rather annoying, but they're getting into some of these YouTube guys and influencers, and so they came across this guy called Mr. Beast. Okay, that's his YouTube name. His real name is like Johnny Donaldson or something, and this guy is 24 years old and makes $12 million a year off of YouTube. All right, and so it's interesting because, again, we can look at the success he has just as we can look at the success of many billionaires and go, oh man, that must be great to live the life they're living, but we often fail to miss the significant portion of their early life where they were working very hard to accomplish and create what they've what they've been able to reap. But anyway, the kids were watching this guy, and they were going around and eating all these extravagant foods. They were paying like $700 for a grilled cheese. They paid $70,000 for a pizza. And I just sat there and I shook my head and I'm like, oh my gosh, my kids, of course, think this is great. Dad, look at this. Look at how much money he's spending on a pizza. And I'm going, you know what? $70,000 for 8 pieces of pizza? I just don't know if I can justify that one, right? Like, I don't care how good it is, or if you put gold on your steak or your hamburger, wow, I struggled with that. But then he turned around and he did a bunch of videos where he gave a whole bunch of money to a whole bunch of people, right? There was one video where he walked into a department store. He literally hired people off the street to come in and buy everything that was in the store, and he donated the entire store to an organization and a charity, all right? And so I had to kind of be like, okay, how do I work with this with my kids? Because in many ways, he's doing what we should do, right? I'm not saying we should go out and spend $70,000 on pizza, but I do believe that God wants us to enjoy some of the things in this creation, right? But we also have the responsibility to care for others, right? To use our resources in a way that help pull people up who are at the bottom, who find themselves down and out, whether it's because of their own choices or whether because stuff just has been uphill for them their whole life and there's nothing that they could do. They just are in the situation because that's the hand that life has dealt to them, okay? But one of the problems then is that, again, if we start to vilify the rich and we point fingers at them, what happens when we look at that map and we see those people in Africa and Asia, and what happens? How would we feel if they started pointing fingers at us? Saying, you know what, we understand you're not billionaires, but you know what, you still make way more than we make. You're making $24,000 to $30,000 a year, and I'm sitting here at $1.25 a day, $375 a year, and you're making $25,000 or $30,000. Man, I'd just love to walk in your shoes for one day. Okay? Friends, think about the switch that happens when you think about that. Okay? And one of the things that I will say is that each one of those groups, the billionaires, us as middle class, which is many of us, and even those poor people, we have something to offer based on the resources that God has given us. Okay? And so again, friends, I watched another video this week, and it was really interesting because this guy walked out and he pretended his car ran out of gas, right? So he goes up to a homeless lady and he says, look, can you just spare a few dollars? My car ran out of gas. And she looks at him and she's like, are you kidding me? She's living in a tent on the street. And she's like, you're asking me for money? But you know what she did? She walked in, she grabbed the $3 she had and she gave it to him. She's like, you need it way more than I do. And she gave the guy her last $3. Now, friends, again, so we think that the people that don't make as much, they can't give. This woman gave everything she had. Now, the beautiful thing about it was the guy took the money and he said, I can't believe you gave this to me. He handed it back to her along with a wad of $500 and said, here, this is for you. You need this a whole lot more than I need it. All right? And she just broke down in tears because of the generosity. So, friends, regardless of whether you're a billionaire, regardless of whether you're middle income or low income, or whether you're right on the poverty line, you have something to give. You have an ability to share your resources and make life better for everyone. All right? Now, again, we can move into this sense of entitlement, and to some degree, I would say all of us, regardless of age, regardless of income, all of us have some level of entitlement. Right? Here in the Midwest, most of us being middle class, most of us have what I consider to be a pretty strong work ethic, right? We like to think we've earned the things that we have, right? And we don't really like the idea of people wanting to take the things that we've worked so hard for, right? But that's where entitlement leads us. And when we start to look at people who are better off and we play that comparison game saying, you know what, I think I should have what these other people have and I've worked just as hard, or we begin to justify it, we begin to do the very same things that some of the Pharisees do. Right? And if we really get into entitlement and we just think we should get things just because that's the way it is, we can move into resentment and we can become bitter towards people. We can become bitter towards the very rich. We can also become resentful and bitter to the very poor, thinking, you know what, these guys have everything and I should have some and we should redistribute their wealth. And then we can look at them and say, you know what, they don't do anything. We got to stop giving them handouts. They don't deserve this, right? And we can get mad and angry on both ends of the spectrum. Well, friends, again, is that the way Jesus calls us to live our lives? Or does he call us to sort of join hands in this and say, let's care for each other? All right? The other thing when it comes to resources is that in Hebrew tradition, and I think Jesus does this well in his entire ministry and teaching, is he never moves to an area of compulsion, right? He never says, you know what, you need to give this money, or we're going to make the Roman government go through. You need to petition the Roman government to redistribute their wealth and give it to the poor. Right? He says, no, you have to do your part. There's an expectation to give. There's an expectation to tithe. There's an expectation to be hospitable. And again, the Jewish system created ways for people of all wealth and incomes to be able to participate in that system, right? Look at the sacrificial system. If you had a lot of resources, you could afford something like a lamb or a goat to offer as a sacrifice. If you were on the lower end of the spectrum, you could offer a dove or a small bird, or you could offer a little bit of grain, right? You didn't have to do something that made it difficult or put you in a more severe place just to be part of that system. But friends, they were expected. There was the expectation that you would take care of each other. Hospitality amongst the Hebrew and Jewish people was a very fundamental value within their society. Okay, and part of the problem is that it was taken, there were very dire consequences, let me put it that way, if you didn't show that sort of intimate hospitality. Now, friends, again, part of this, again, one of the issues that I see at least, is that oftentimes people don't want to be part of the process in this. They want to just seem to take the path of least resistance and only want to be part of the outcome, right? And again, this is going to get a little political, and I apologize for this, but one of the movements right now, especially from the more democratic, liberal-minded people, is they want to give a whole bunch of authority to the government, the federal government, to redistribute wealth from other people to people that are in need. Now, friends, I'm going to say that's not a bad thing, right? There are problems in our system, right? It's kind of unfair that there seems to be a whole lot of tax breaks and loopholes for people of wealth or business operations and corporations that they don't pay their fair share. So there are problems within our system. However, I don't believe that our government was ever intended to be the sole benefactor of redistributing resources. And if we only want to make it that way so that we can compel other people, then we run in danger, because are we truly giving the things that we have? Are we truly sharing our own resources, or do we just want other people to take over that responsibility? And so again, friends, this might be a more conservative mindset, but one of the things that I always look at is, where is your giving? Because I believe your giving, your generosity, and your hospitality always starts with you. And you need to be part of the process. And friends, I'll even say that the church in many ways has abdicated some of its responsibility. I just saw some statistics, I want to say it was from Pew Research, that showed that only 12 or 13% of people believe that the church should really have a say in how resources are distributed. Well, friends, that's pretty doggone low, because the church is supposed to be out there caring for people. And when we don't, people just pass us by. right? And people don't think that we can have an influence, or people don't want us these days to go out and to share things because we might share our religious beliefs with people. All right? But friends, we need to be part of the process. We need to look at our own giving, our own generosity, and say, okay, before I'm going to put any judgment or point any finger, I have to make sure that I'm in the right spot and I'm giving the best that I can. And so here, Jesus really creates a kingdom flip. In literature, we might say this is a reversal of fortunes, right? So the rich man who has everything in this earthly kingdom ends up in hell in the eternal kingdom. Well, this person, Lazarus, who has nothing, now goes up. Okay? And so, friends, again, many of us will wrestle with that. I know I wrestled with this part a whole lot because it's like, what the heck did the guy do? You know, it's one of my money programs, right? When I give, I expect that people are going to be changed because I gave them something. Or I won't give people something because I think they have to do something in order to meet that so they don't waste my resources, right? Those are some money programs that really I had to deal with as I'm sitting here. And so when I read this, the guy just sat out there and begged for his whole life and ends up in heaven, whew, I still don't have my mind wrapped around that. There's part of me that just wants to say, no, that's not right. Let's just change that and move stuff around. But part of that is God also working in my heart saying, you know what, Josh, I've just called you to be generous and hospitable. And you're not to necessarily be concerned with what that person does with your resources. I'm concerned about how you utilize them. Okay? And so, again, as in many times, there's this kingdom flip. And then for the Pharisees and for the Hebrew people, this is a big deal because they too, similar to some of my programs, they too believe that if you had wealth and you had abundance, you had God's favor, you had God's blessing upon your life. And if you didn't have anything, it was because you'd done something wrong or there was sin in your life and that God had said, look, you've done something wrong and that's why you're in the position that you're in. And so Jesus really flips this on the Pharisees, and they're going, again, their whole money world is flipped upside down, going, probably like me, this isn't right. This isn't the way that we understand it. But friends, one of the things that we learn from this story is that there are eternal consequences to the way that we live our life and the way that we utilize our resources. Right? And so all of a sudden this rich guy finds himself in hell going, oh my gosh, I enjoyed plenty and luxury all of my life, and now I only want just one drop of water to land on my tongue so that I can quench some of this thirst. Right? And this poor guy, Lazarus, who had nothing in his whole life, now gets to enjoy comfort and provision with God in heaven for all time. All right? So the moral or the point of this story is, friends, if you are in a position where you're really struggling right now, or maybe you know someone that's really struggling, that God sees that person. That God's not just going to walk by that person every day. God knows exactly where that person is and what's going on in their life. And He's reaching out saying, look, you might not have a lot here, but if you just come into me, I can give you the provision you need. Right? Now, again, some of us might wrestle with that because it's like, well, if God's really going to give provision, then why are they still poor? Well, friends, fortunately, if you look at some of the statistics, is even though there's a lot of poverty, it's continued to decrease through time. We are doing some good work in helping alleviate poverty, even among some of these poorest countries. All right? But to those of us that have abundance, again, it should serve as a reminder to say, look, you're responsible to share these. You're responsible, and some of your actions have consequences. Now, friends, I know that the idea of hell is not very popular anymore. We don't like to talk about it. Many of us I shouldn't say many of us, but there are many people that now ascribe to this sense of universalism, right? That no matter what you do, no matter who you worship, basically all paths lead to heaven because God is just all loving and good, and no matter what we do, we just get to go to heaven. Well, friends, again, Jesus spent a lot of time talking about judgment. He spent a lot of time talking about hell, and we need to be prepared to make sure that we are indeed living in relationship, that Jesus is Lord and Savior of our life, and that in turn, then we are going out and living as He called us to live. Now, friends, earlier in chapter 12, Luke tells a parable, and he says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. And that, I think, principle may be aptly applied again here, because the rich man's treasure was all of his earthly goods, all of his earthly resources, and he wasn't willing to share those with anyone. And so we might say, again, his heart was focused on those treasures. And so he pleads with Abraham, and again, Abraham, the great patriarch, a very wealthy man who was also noted for his generosity and his hospitality, says, look, friend, I appreciate that you're compassionate, you want to warn your brothers and your family because of this, but guess what? They already have the law and the prophets. And the law and the prophets have spoke over and over about how you are to live, how you are to share these resources with other people. And he says, if they don't listen to them, that's their own fault. And he pleads one more time, saying, no, if you'll just send Lazarus back, they'll listen. And again, Abraham says, no, they have the law and the prophet. And if they will not listen to them, then they're going to be stuck, because it's all there. It's been laid out. And friends, the same goes for us. We've been told for how many times how we are supposed to be generous, how we're supposed to love and care for our neighbor, how we're supposed to invite all people to the table, but how many of us do it? And what might the consequences be? And like I said, what might have happened had the rich man just simply offered Lazarus a plate of food? What if he simply would have offered him a little bit of hospitality and cared for him? Might it have changed his entire life? Only time will tell. So friends, as we end this morning, I really encourage you to reflect on some of your money programs and really look at how they determine how and what you spend your resources on. Okay? Because if you're like me, you'll still find, even after years of doing this, that some of these money programs pop up and some of them just aren't so good. Right? And then secondly, this week, I really want to encourage you to find 2 or more ways this week to generously share the resources you have with someone in need. And I should have bolded or underlined that part, in need, right? I don't need to go to Jan and say, hey, I'm going to share my resources with you. Let's go get a cup of coffee, right? Well, as much as Jan might like that cup of coffee, is she really in need? No, probably not for that cup of coffee. So, I know we can argue, right? We can justify it saying it's good, right? But think about that. What would it look like to go to the store and grab a bag of groceries and say, I'm going to donate this to the food pantry? Or what would it look like to go through your closet and say, I've got this pretty nice outfit. I wonder what somebody that doesn't have something this nice might feel like if they got to be dressed in this, and you donate that to the clothes closet, right? Better go quick, because people got to get to Hardee's before the Lutherans do.
So I just feel compelled to share this as like an actionable way to live this out. There was a woman who is doing a lot of work, self-work, working with God to be in a different place. And she is one of the ones doing the Bible, reading the Bible cover to cover. She has, her resources are Social Security, so not a lot. In conversing with the Lord, she feels as though she got to purchase 20 books. And so that was quite a big purchase, because they were $20 a piece. And so her and her husband walked obediently through this, and for some they charged, for some they even gave them away for free. And through this journey, on top of that, she started to feel very compelled to start praying for people, just everybody, when she's out and about. So apparently there were some pretty big shootings down in the Texas region. And they were in that region driving by, stopped at a gas station, and apparently it was very palpable that the atmosphere was tense and it hadn't been a good day. And so the person that was checking her out was almost to tears when she offered to pray for her. And the thing that touched me the most about this is that, one, she accepted. The boss, unbeknownst, was like right next there. But the reverence that everyone behind this woman showed, because everyone kind of bowed their heads or were silent. So in a time where we're so divided, God moves in powerful ways when we step into obedience. So I do really challenge you to find a way that you can live this out this week, because I know a lot of times I look at these and I don't do them. So I just would really, really challenge you to do that. All right.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and hopefully you'll be more obedient in the action steps from that. No. But that is a beautiful story. And so again, friends, we just never know whose life we might touch when we just allow God and the Spirit to lead us in that moment. So friends, hope you'll work on those action steps, and I invite you to now move into a time of prayer. And so I ask if there